Okay, the lights go down. And the microphone turns on. This is good. So far, the tech's working. We'll see whether or not that continues into the rest of the talk. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm sure there's going to be people arriving, but I'm going to be honest, I have quite a lot of demos to do, so if people walk in their own, they're going to miss a little bit of the intro, so I'm just going to get started. So Azure Static Web Apps. For the last few years, since they've been in preview, they have been, I can only think of the Dutch word, my lievelingsresource inside of Azure. I really enjoy playing with them because they are basically awesome. For anybody that went to Melissa's talk this morning, basically all the things she went through is why I adore them. We have that build and deploy pipeline that you get out of the box, created for you by the Azure portal, so that if you're just getting started, you still get CI/CD out of the box, staging environments created for you and cleaned up for you. When you finish your PRs, there is authentication built into the free tier. It's all abstracted away in such a way that you don't need to be an expert on authentication in order to start using it. And on top of all this, it's just really simplified and really cheap to get started. Now, this talk is taking it kind of a little bit further. We're not going to be using that default pipeline. We are going to be writing 3 pipelines today in order to use this in a more professional, enterprisey environment. Now, there's a little bit of a story about why I wrote this talk. Basically, last year, I was giving a talk at Azure Live. And about an hour before I'm due to go and talk about what you can do with authentication inside of Azure Static Web Apps, someone just turns to me and goes, yeah, but you know what? Static Web Apps, they're just toys, really, aren't they? You can't do anything with them. It's not like you could ever use them in any kind of professional setting. I want control. I'm like, 2 things there. 1, please don't ever do that to a speaker an hour before they're due to give a talk on that particular subject. And try not to fall down behind the hole behind you either. And secondly, it kind of triggered me. It's like, no, I'm going to prove you wrong. You are not going to attack my favorite resource like this. So I said about, okay, by the end of the year, start of next year, I'm going to do a talk that just deals with workflows, does everything in a pipeline exactly as we would want to do inside of our professional environments. Hey, look at that. The clicker doesn't work. Because of course it doesn't. Never, ever, ever say, hey, look, the tech works before you get started. There we go. So, hi, I'm Stacy Cashmore. I am a Tech Explorer DevOps at Omniplan, a financial software company based in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. I have been developing software since about the mid-1990s, which the further on it goes, the scarier that sounds to me. And for the last few years, I am still super psyched and honored to be able to say that I can call myself a Microsoft MVP in developer technologies. Now, that's pretty much all that I have for the slides. So everything now is going to be demos, so please, everybody, keep your fingers crossed that GitHub and Azure do everything that they're supposed to do, and that all of, the demos actually work as they're supposed to. It's going to be fine. It's not Wednesday morning. The first thing that I want to go through with you today is that default pipeline that Melissa was showing in her session, because I still believe for an out-of-the-box experience getting started, this thing is spectacular. When you create a static web app in the portal will go to your repo, and it will create this workflow for you. We have a trigger. So when you do a push to main, or whatever branch you say is your trunk branch, or if you make a pull request against that branch, this workflow is going to trigger, and it's going to do some interesting stuff for us. If we do a push to main, or if we're doing a pull request, which is anything except for closed, then we are going to use this Azure Static Web App deploy v1 action, and we're going to pass into that a secret that the Azure portal also puts into our repo when it sets it up. We're going to pass in a token for our GitHub repo so that we can update our pull request. And then we're going to say, I always like this, it's a GitHub action that has an action. And we're going to upload our new site. At the very basic level, we pass in the app location, the API location, and the output location, and all sorts of wonderful magic happens inside of here that figures out what language you are using, how you need to build your application, what language you're using for your Azure functions. It then updates your website for the configuration so that Azure knows what type of Azure functions to provision for your API, if it needs to provision anything. Bundles all that up, publishes up to Azure, checks to make sure that everything's working as it should be, and then lets you run your new website in production with you not really knowing how this is done and not needing to know how this is done. And at this point, if you're in a pull request, then it's going to spin up a new environment. It's going to put a link to that environment in your comments in your pull request so you can easily find where to test. When you close a pull request, it's then going to clean that up for you because you only have a limited amount of staging slots inside of a static web app. It's either 2 or 3 for a free tier, 5 for a standard tier. So you want to make sure that you clean up after yourself, and this does all of that for you. But for that person that was speaking to me at the conference, it does have some issues. First things first, we're having to manually create that static web app inside of the portal. Now, obviously, we don't want to do this every time we create something if we're using it inside of a professional environment. We want to be able to create this the same way over and over and know what's happening. Also, whilst I do think that this action is absolutely awesome, it's also a little bit opaque. And maybe we want to have a little bit more knowledge and control about what's going on when we deploy our code. And lastly, this doesn't run any tests or anything else. And whilst you can put it into this workflow, of course, that was just the other comment that I had of, but I want to write my workflow. I don't want this thing out of the box. So today, that's what we're going to be doing. Now, say we're going to write 3 workflows. The first one that we're going to write is to create that Azure resource so that we can get it working. So what we're going to do is inside of my, wow, this is really interesting, trying to go between 2 screens at such distance. We're going to create a new folder. We want a new folder, and we're going to call that .github workflows. So for those that don't know GitHub, anything that you put in here, which is a valid YAML file conforming to the GitHub needs, it will give you access to an action inside of GitHub. You don't need to then go into GitHub and do your own thing. Inside of there, we are going to create our first file, and that's going to be iac.yaml. So give me a new file there. And we need to give it a little bit of a trigger. Come on, thank you. So we're going to give it a name. Create and set up SWA infrastructure seems to make sense. And I am giving this a workflow dispatch trigger because I don't want to run this every time I change my code. I only want to run this when I change my infrastructure, so I want to be in control of when this one gets triggered. Then we need some variables that we're going to use inside of our pipeline to pass along to Azure. We need to pass in the resource group because I want to tell it where to create things, the name of the static web app itself, and the region that I want to run it in. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I saw a blog post on GitHub that, as well as having repository secrets, you can now do repository variables. And I'm going to be honest, when they're in GA, I won't be using this anymore because that gives us a lot more flexibility. And as we're going to use these between pipelines, it means we're not going to do typos quite so much and bang our heads against the table when things don't work as we expect. Then we can actually get on with our actual jobs. So we're going to have a job here. I have snippets I'm bringing across, by the way, because I know I'm going to do typos, and I'd rather that this does actually work. So we're going to run a job just to check that, or just to create the SWA. This workflow is only going to have one job. We're going to run that on Ubuntu latest, and the very first thing that we need to do is get access to our code. So we are going to do a checkout of our code here. Next one that we need to do, because we are going to be using the AZ CLI in order to create our static web apps, we need to log into Azure inside of the pipeline. Now, I'm logging in here with secret credentials. I probably wouldn't actually recommend doing this. I would probably do it using certificates, which is a more secure way, less chance of things leaking. I'm going to link to a blog post on that in Twitter when I'm done. It was written by a friend of mine in the Netherlands. He explains it really well. And then after we've logged in, then we're just going to run a couple of AZ CLI commands. Where are we? There. So the first one that we're going to do is just create the resource group. Now, I had a chat with somebody when I was writing this, and they went, well, isn't that going to die? But no, this is idempotent. You can run this many times, and it's not going to break anything. So this is safe to put here. And the second one that we're going to do is run an AZ deploy create on the next line. And this is going to run against a bicep file. So we're going to use bicep in order to control and create our static web app in our pipeline. Now, that doesn't exist in this repo at the moment, so we're going to come back and do that one in a minute. Last thing that I want to do, because I am connecting to a Cosmos DB for this app, you've not seen it running yet, because I want to show you it running after I've created it via the pipeline, so fingers crossed. I need to give it access to my Cosmos DB, tell it where the containers are, tell it what the database is, so just set a few environment settings. And we can do this, if I get back to the start of the line. Come on, little laptop, you can do it. Using an AZ Static Web App command line. So there's two different CLIs we're going to be using today. One is AZ, mainly using this Static Web App command, and the other one is a Static Web App CLI itself. I'm using both of them because at the moment they both kind of do different things. There's a little bit of an overlap, but you're going to need to go backwards and forwards to get this working. I hope that kind of converges at some point, and you can pick the technology that you want to use. So that is our entire pipeline that we need to not have to go into the portal in order to create our application. But we still need that bicep file. So let's quickly set that up. I'm going to add a new file in the root. Whoops, no, I'm not going to add a new folder. I'm going to add a new file. Don't misclick. Main.bicep, and I have the simplest possible bicep here for creating a static web app. I'm passing in 3 parameters, so one for the location, but I'm just going to default that to the resource group. Passing in a parameter for the name, and I'm passing in a parameter for the SKU, which I'm defaulting to the free tier. But we're going to do something different in the pipeline. The bicep itself, in order to create it just a standard vanilla static web app, you only need the name, the location, the SKU, and an empty properties object. Depending on your needs, there's a whole host of stuff that you can do here, but that's kind of half a talk on its own, so I'm kind of ignoring that one for today. But I'm going to share a link to all of the resources so that you can see exactly what you can do in here at the end of the talk. And that is it. If we now push this up to GitHub, so we add IAC, and then if that works, come on, push. Thank you. If we go to the right browser, this is my repo. If I refresh this, hopefully we have that workflow file, which we don't. Why don't we have that workflow file? Oh, that's a good start, isn't it? Am I in the right place? Excuse me a second. NCD London, this should work. That synced. Is this a bit where GitHub dies on me on the very first demo and I kind of like cry? No, I'm on main. that is interesting. Give me 2 seconds. Come on. No, there's nothing left to push. Everything's up to date. And I don't have any actions. Wowzer. OK, I'm going to cheat here. What I'm going to do is reclone the repo. I'm going to copy this stuff across to that repo, and I'm going to just push that one up instead. So git clone. Where's my link? Sorry about this. In all of the run-throughs that I've done, this is one issue that I've not encountered. Was it there? Sorry? And you can see it and I can't. Are you looking at Stacy Cashmore's NCD London? Oh, wow. Oh. Did I push it to the wrong place? I pushed it to the wrong place, haven't I?
It's on there. It's not in the workflow folder, so it's in there.
I put it in the wrong place. Give me 2 seconds. I'm going to fix this one then. We'll move it to the right place. That's fine. This doesn't put me behind schedule at all. I'm not seeing it. Where did I create that? I've obviously created it in the wrong folder. I've misclicked somewhere. Oh, well, that was stupid, wasn't it? I put it in the VS Code folder. Did I?
Still in the VS folder.
Move. Thank you. Idiot, Stacy. Shall we try that one again? Thank you for the help, by the way. Really appreciate it.
Don't thank us yet.
Now it's in the right place.
And it's still, what? I know I put that in the right place this time.
See, I think the workflows folder isn't on the GitHub folder yet. Not that some button.
Oh, come on. OK, let's try and work on this one. So we have the GitHub. We want to move that into GitHub. Move. Right. Try again. Oh, yeah. And if you're going to make them, don't make these mistakes when you're doing the run-through in the privacy of your own home. Do them when people are watching you and you're kind of like stressing on stage. It's way more fun. Hey, look at that. I have a workflow. Thank you. So we're going to kick this workflow off. And what this is now going to do is create Azure Static Web App. It's not going to deploy anything yet, though, because we've not got any of that in this pipeline. It's just going to make the resource for us. Hopefully, the next ones I can do a little bit quicker and get working. Now, the next workflow that I want to do is the custom domain. I want to add a custom domain to my application. One, because if I'm running it in production, as much as the default names are really fun with Yellow Beach or whatever else, they don't exactly roll off the tongue. The other issue is we're now creating this in a pipeline. We have no idea what that name might be. With an app service, the name or the URL is included in the name, which makes the naming interesting because you've got to avoid clashes with every other Azure user in the world. With a static web app, that name only has to be unique in your resource group, but the downside is that you never know what the URL is going to be. So we're going to add a custom domain here, just so that we know once it's been deployed, we can go to this location and it's going to work. So we're going to add a new workflow, and hopefully we're going to add this in the right place. We're going to call that custom domain. And again, we're going to have this on a workflow dispatch. And I'm not doing this in the same location as the IAC for two reasons. One, you're probably not going to need to run it every time you play with your environment. You're only going to need to run it when you set up a new environment. And two, DNS records are a pain in the neck, and I suspect this is going to fail at least once before our DNS records are propagated as we want them to. Again, we need some environment variables so that we can access our static web app. And we're passing the subdomain in here, only I'm going to rename it. I don't want it to be ent_demo. I want it to be NDC London. Whoops. Then we have to set up the job. This is going to look very similar to the other job. So we are going to get our code, because I have some applications I need to run in order for this to work. We're going to log into Azure, because we need to have access to Azure to change those custom domains. We need to find out what our current host name is, because we're going to do this on a subdomain. You can also do this on the Apex domain, but it's slightly different. But for a subdomain, what you need to do is set up a DNS record, a CNAME DNS record that points to the resource that you're trying to access. We don't know what that is yet, because we've just created it in a pipeline and we've not seen this. But by using the AZ Static Web App environment list, we can actually see what environments we have available, and we can get that host name out of the system. Now, the important one here is when we do a query, which is kind of a little bit further along the line, over here. Every time you make a staging environment, you make a new environment with a new host name, and you need to know that you've got the right one. The production host name will always have the name of default. So this is the one that we want to access in order to do our, in order to put it into our DNS record. Then we need to set our DNS record, and I'm going to be honest, I'm not going to talk you through this just because all DNS providers are different. I have written just a little application for my DNS provider just so that I can do this on the fly. I'm sure that different ones have their own API that can be used. But this is just going to create that DNS record that we need. And then last but not least, we need to actually set the custom domain itself. So we have another step to put in the end. And here we're going to do the static web app hostname set. And we're going to use the host name that we set in the environment variable. So this should be ndc-london.stacy.cloud. Keep your fingers crossed. This should be live in about 5 minutes. And that is everything that we need for this, if I've not broken the YAML, which is something I do regularly. If there's one thing I've had from writing this talk is I hate YAML. Add custom domain. Let's commit and sync that. Let's hope that goes to the right place. And let's see if we have a resource created yet, or if my pipeline failed. It worked. We have a resource that has been created for us. So this one has gone through, created our resource. We'll look at that in the portal in a second, just to prove that it's there. And in the meantime, what we're going to do is kick off this custom domain. like I say, I am expecting to need to run this one twice. I'm currently at about a 75% hit rate of it working. But bearing in mind how it's gone so far, it's not going to work first run today. The DNS record's not going to propagate, and we're going to have to kick it off a second time. While that's going, let's just have a look at our static web app in the portal just to prove that it is actually there. So in my resource groups, we have this end demo. We have end demo SWA. That's the one that we just created. And if we go to the URL, which I can't read from here, Brave Smoke. See, they're awesome names. They are quite funny. They're just not necessarily useful in a production environment. So your Azure Static Web App is live and waiting for your content. So we've got that first step now. We've not been into the portal, but we have a static web app. And in a minute, it's even going to run on a custom domain. Next step is actually getting something in there that does what we want. So for this one, I'm going to make a pipeline, but first of all, I want to deploy it from the CLI to kind of show you the steps I'm doing, and then we'll put it into the pipeline and run it again. Now, so that we can see the different ways that this runs, I am going to make some subtle changes to the code for each run, unless I forget. 50% chance of that too. On my index page, underneath the header, we're just going to have a div. No. We're going to have a div that just says deployed by CLI. Now, there's one other change that I need to make to my application before I go to the CLI, and that is to tell the static web app what it's running on, what technology it's using. In my intro, I said that that default pipeline sets up something inside of your SWA that says whether or not you're running on Node or Python or .NET, isolated, not isolated, whatever. The deployment process we're going to be doing now doesn't do that because it has no idea. We are in full control, but that also means that we have full responsibility. So we're going to need to add just a little bit of something to our config file, which is in our www root. We have our static web app config file. This is a superb resource, again, a talk on its own. You could control your static web app from here. I have something here to protect my endpoints. I've got a navigation fallback so that if you hit F5 somewhere, it knows how to serve your code. And we've now added this platform at the top that tells it, always run in a .NET isolated function. With this in place, now we can actually start to do some building and some deploying. So my professional pipeline, number one, I want to check that everything works. So let's run some tests. Let's not run some tests, eh? Let's run some tests. Now, I only have 2 tests in this project because I wanted just enough for the demo, but you get the idea. It builds, it runs, and we should hopefully have test passing. Yay! After we've done that, we are going to need to publish our client and our API, because this is all things that was done for us in the previous pipeline. Now, this can take like 15, 20 seconds or so, because we're optimizing the Blazor assemblies. And of course, it knows that I'm slightly behind, so it's going to take just that little bit longer just to have a go at me. And then we want to publish our API. And then once we have this, now we can deploy these published files up to our static web app. But we have another problem. The portal, when you create your static web app, puts the deploy token into your secrets for you. We've not done that yet. We don't know what the secret is. But there is a command that will give it to us. So we're going to call. Is that readable, by the way, at the back? Can you see that? Or do I need to zoom in? It's OK? OK. So we can use this AZ static web app and get the list of our secrets. And then we're going to query it for the API key. Stick that in a variable. Stick that in a variable. Thank you. And once we have that available, we can now do a deploy. And this deploy isn't using the AZ Static Web App. At the moment, or at least at the time of writing this last week, the SWA deploy action, it was only available in that SWA deploy, which you have to install via Node. You can do a whole lot with the SWA CLI. You can run it locally. You can create, initialize static web apps, log into Azure, do your deploys. It's quite an awesome little CLI. You can see at the end, though, we are now deploying only into production. You need to put that end production, otherwise it will just deploy by default into a preview slot called preview. So we're going to run this one now. And this is a point where I really hope that Azure plays ball with us. This should take about 30 seconds. On Wednesday and on Tuesday night, it was taking 3 minutes and then crashing out on me, because I don't know if you noticed, but there were issues in Azure earlier on this week. We're going to let that one run, and we're going to see whether or not our custom domain at least worked. Do we? It's green! Wow, it ran first time whilst I was actually doing the talk. That is awesome. So now, if we go to NDC London.stacy.cloud. That's interesting. Why did that not work? NDC London. That is the one I used, right? See why I use code snippets? Because typing's hard. Like, really hard. I apologize. Oh, come on. You know what? I'm going to do this in a really cheating way. If I refresh this page, I should actually get my link right here on the page. So we'll just load it from here, shall we? Cool. OK, this one I have not had before. Apparently, Azure's just deciding to play ball. Trust me, this does work. Always a fun phrase to use in the middle of a demo. Nope. OK, fair enough. That one's crashing on us. How is our deploy going? We'll come back and see whether or not that one gets happier later. 105 seconds, 120 seconds. I can tell you that this isn't going to work. So I'm going to cancel this one now and continue. I really don't know what it is with Azure. It really is this week. It's just been really playing. You had it this morning as well, didn't you? Not doing something. Wow, it did work. It just wanted to make me a liar. So,
Publicly complain, then they will act.
Does that mean that my site is actually up now? Or is, nope. Can I get back to the original one? OK, we have a deployed application. We have my to-do list. We can make stuff and we can save it. What we can't do yet, though, is log in. Now, I'm not going to put any standard authentication into here, just because if I'm using this in a professional environment, I wouldn't use the standard authentication. It has some issues. Number one is you have to do it via invite links, which means when you recreate your environment, you're also going to have to recreate all of those users, send out all of those links, and get your users to click them in a certain amount of time. It's not the best experience.
Your domain did go through. It's probably a DNS cache on
Right, OK. Awesome, but it worked. OK, so if you check on your phone. Yeah, OK. So eventually it's going to work. But if you look on your phone, you should be able to see it at least. You'll also see that this is a responsive site, which is quite cool. So that's one reason why I wouldn't use standard authentication here. The other reason why I wouldn't use it is when you run standard authentication, or when you use standard authentication, every user has a unique ID. And if you use your Twitter login between different static web apps, you have a different ID. It's recreated for every Azure static web app. which means that if we have infrastructure as code and something happens and we recreate it, all of the records associated with that user ID are now orphaned records and we can't get to them. So in a professional environment, I would always use the custom authentication. That gives you a fixed ID from the authentication provider. I was hoping to show you that today, but I got a slight idea that we're not quite going to reach that part. So I will write a blog post about that one instead for you. OK, so what we've just done on the command line, let's put that into what we've just done on the CLI, let's put that into a pipeline and see what happens. Now, number one, I want to change my index file because I want pipeline. And then I want to create my new pipeline at the top. So we're going to have our build and deploy pipeline that we're going to put into here. And the top of this pipeline is going to look a little bit similar to what we get out of the box, because that is the trigger that we want. We want only push to the main, or we want a pull request which is opened, synchronized, reopened, or closed. You'll see that I've got a couple of paths ignore in there, and that's because if I make a change to the custom domain pipeline or the IAC pipeline, I don't need to redeploy my application. I can change the infrastructure of my static web app without needing to rerun this pipeline, so we're going to ignore that one. Then, again, we're going to use these environment variables. See why I say once those environment variables are in general availability, I'm going to use them. It's going to stop me having to put so much into my pipelines. And for the deployment, we just need the resource group and the SWA name. Then we have a job. And for the first run through, I'm going to cheat for this job. I'm going to use it for everything, not just for building and testing. We want to run this one when we have a push to our main branch or when we have a pull request, which is anything but closed, because this is going to be the deployment flow. We're also checking out our code there, obviously, because otherwise we have nothing to deploy. We're going to be setting up .NET, and we're running .NET 7 for this, so we need to include that in our pipeline for our build flow. And once we have that, we're going to run everything that we just ran in the command line. So we're going to run our tests, and if they pass, we're going to publish both the client and the API, get it ready for use. Then we need to do the SWA flow. And for that one, first of all, we need to log into Azure. So same as we did in our IAC. And then we need to get access to that secret the same way that we did in the command line. Extra steps, though, because we need to add this line underneath. We need to add a mask to that variable that we're getting out of the CLI. Otherwise, if you went to Heather's talk yesterday, you're going to be exposing your secrets in your logs, because GitHub isn't quite as secure as it should be when looking at the log files. It's good, but it's not perfect. Interesting one for this, by the way. If you use GitHub output, then you can share your variables between your steps. You can also do an output from a job. I could not get that to work with the mask. I've had this written in 4 different ways, and it works perfectly right up until the point where I add the mask. And as soon as I add the mask, this is not available outside of the job that I put it in. I don't know if that's by design or not, but it's something useful to know. And then once we have that, now we can just do the deploy, which is kind of the same as we did before. So we're going to install Node, because that Static Web Apps CLI that I was talking about, you get from NPM. So we're going to install it from NPM. And then we're going to deploy our client from the www root folder, our API, using that deployment token, and we're still pushing up to production here. We're going to deal with the staging. 15 minutes, we can do the staging. We're going to do the staging environments in a minute, because there's a few extra steps that we need to take there. But for now, let's actually get our automated build working and deploy from our pipeline rather than our own command line. Add build pipeline. with another typo in it, because of course. So hopefully that's going to push up, and hopefully I've put everything in the right place this time. And we should be able to go to here, go to our actions, and we can see that it's already kicked off. So we have our CI/CD working. We do a push to main. This gets built and deployed. It's going to take a few minutes to deploy. So while we're doing that, let's carry on with our staging environment and see what we need to do there. So the staging environment, that's only available in a pull request. So I'm not actually going to make these changes inside of the main branch. I'm going to make a feature branch for this, push it up to a pull request, and watch everything happen that way. So let's add a new branch. For that, add staging. Now I want to change my index.razor again, because now we're deployed via PR. And then we're going to change our pipeline just a little bit. Now, the first one that I want to do is I want to split up my workflow. I want one job that does the testing in the building, and I want another job that actually pushes it up to Azure so that I can roll back easily in the future. When it fails, I only have to do the push to Azure rather than run everything again. So in order to do that, first thing that we need to do is, after we've built our API, we're going to push our entire dist folder up to GitHub Artifacts so that we can use it in the next step. And then we're going to separate this with a new job. Now, this is going to run exactly the same as the other one did. Have I got that in the right place? Yes. So it's going to run on a push, or it's going to run on a pull request, which isn't closed. But it's also only going to run after the build and test job finish. So if the build fails, obviously we have nothing to push up, so that one's not going to run. And then the first step that we do is then download all of those artifacts that we just pushed up at the end of the previous job. Now, in my original workflow, we had this production flag here. So we actually need a step to figure out what environment we should be pushing up to. I'm just going to do that with a small script that just simply says, if it's a push, then I'm going to production. If it's not a push, then I'm going to a staging environment. So I want my environment to be staging, and then the PR number of my push. This has some rules to it. This has to be alphanumeric only, so you can't do a dash or a dot or anything else. If you do a dash or a dot or anything else, it will just always push to preview, which took me a little bit of time bashing my head against a table a couple of months ago, getting my head around. Now that we have that available, we can change our deployment step so that we now deploy to that environment flag that we got from the previous step. So this will now, the same as the default pipeline does. Okay. Same as the default pipeline does, this one will create you your environment on the fly. And it means that if you run out of staging slots because you've got loads of pull requests open, you can do some manual cleaning inside of the portal or on the command line. And if you need to look at that PR again, you can just kick off that workflow a second time, and it will just recreate it on the fly for you every single time. Last step that we need to do on this side of things is when we are making a pull request, we want an easy way to find the location. That out-of-the-box workflow, it puts a comment on your pull request that you can just click on and go straight to your test environment. And I want to do the same thing here. So after we've deployed, what we're going to do is get that staging host name. And we're going to use the same command that we used in order to do our custom domain. So the AZ Static Web App environment list. Only now, rather than looking for that default name, we have a different query that says if the host name contains our environment, because the URL for your staging environment always contains the staging environment name, then get me that host name out and put it in a variable that I can use in a future step. And the last step for the PR is updating the GitHub PR itself. And here I'm using GitHub script. I'm just putting some markup in here which says, staging environment's been updated, you can test it in this location, and this is a person that kicked it off. And then we use a GitHub REST API in order to push it up to GitHub and make it available for us. So that's how we get our staging environments. Now we need to clean the staging environments up when we finish our pull request. So we have one last job to add to this. Now, that last job, this is only going to run on a pull request when it's closed. Again, we are logging into the AZ command line, and we are going to use that AZ Static Web App environment command in order to delete the environment. Interesting one here, if you want to deploy, you have to use the SWA CLI. If you want to clean your environments up, you have to use the AZ Static Web App CLI. So it would be nice if they converge at some point, but right now you just have to flick between the two of them. So that's now our completed workflow. So checking that I am actually in a branch, and I am. Let's push that up, add staging. Let us commit and sync this. We do want to push that up. And hopefully, she says, oh, we need to make a pull request first. Of course we do. Let's make our pull request. And this should, hopefully, after a couple of seconds, kick off that pipeline for us. There we go. So that's now going to do the builds and create those environments. That's going to take about 5 minutes to run. So we'll come back and check on that in a second. In the meantime, I did see that my add build pipeline worked. So if I come back to my, I'm going to try it here again. There we go, the Wi-Fi cleared. We now have my deployed by pipeline, so we can see that the changes I've made, it's come up from that pipeline. It's not this CLI deploy. So we now have our CI/CD flow, but we are in full control of it on how we want to run that. While we're waiting for this, I want to show you then how to run this locally. Because it's all very well running it inside of Azure, inside of a staging environment, but you should really be checking your stuff locally as well before you push it up. So for that one, I have my application here open inside of Visual Studio, and in theory, it should start everything, and it's not. So I need to change my startup projects so that I start my API and I start my client. My eyesight is getting worse the older I get. So we're going to start these up. And the problem that we have running a static web app locally is your client is going to be running on one port number. Your API is going to be running on another port number, and they don't know how to talk to each other. The static web app in production, it has some awesome glue that puts all of this together so that we don't need to worry about that. When Azure Static Web Apps were in preview, there was no way to do this aside from adding a load of code that just basically figured out if you're running it in development, then get your API from a different location than if you're running in production. Thankfully, they brought out the Static Web Apps CLI, same one that we used for the deployment. And now, if we go to our command line and we say SWA start, so that what this will do is spin up a Node.js server which pretends to be an Azure Static Web App, and they say themselves, this is not the same as a static web app, but it's good enough for local testing, but always test in Azure. And we need to point to HTTP localhost, if I can type, 5001, I think this runs on. So we now have this localhost 4280. No, I don't want you to do that. Where's this opening? That's not in the right browser. Phooey. That is the right browser. So now if we go to localhost 4280, we should have something that takes just a little bit longer to run because it has to get all the files through the static web app, and that does add a little bit of time to it. And we should now be able to access everything that we need to do. Now, looking at the time, I'm not going to go through this in the detail I wanted. There's one thing that I really do want to mention, though. If you're doing Blazor development, you have to run your static web app version in the same browser that you're running your Visual Studio version of your code. Because to debug a Blazor WASM application, Visual Studio does all sorts of wonderful tunneling, but it only works for this browser. So if you take this and run it in a different browser, you'll suddenly find none of your debug points get hit, and you think, what the beep's going on here? And again, start to pull your hair out. Don't be me, don't do that. How are we doing for our deployment? There's one more thing that I do want to cover, even if I can't do the in-depth thing I want to do. So let's see if our pipeline ran, and it's not finished yet. Why are you not finished yet? We're doing the deploy. Is this doing what it did locally and just taking an age to finish? It is doing what it did locally and taking an age to finish. Okay, we will see what happens with that one. Hopefully we'll come back to this. So the last bit that I wanted to do is briefly walk you through what you need to do in order to move from that standard authentication to the custom authentication that I mentioned at the beginning. Right now, this application uses standard authentication. You log in via Twitter. Everything is set up to read the client principal that the static web app supplies for you and use it inside of your application. When you change to a standard tier, you get access to, I can do this inside of a different one. Let's stop that one because I don't need that one anymore. When you want to do this inside when you want to move to custom authentication, there's two things that you have to do. One is you have to use a standard tier app. You cannot do this in the free tier, which is why my pipeline, I set it up to use the standard tier, even though the template defaulted to free. Second thing that you have to do is actually tell the static web app that you want to use this custom authentication. So for that one, we need to put just a little bit of code, again, inside of our static web app config folder, which is somewhere around here again. This has to go at the top. And you give it an auth object. This will tell it to use the custom authentication. You can give it a roles source. And this means that you no longer use the portal or the static web app itself to invite your users and to give them whatever roles they need. We're now getting this from a special Azure function that we're going to create. And this function is only available to the static web app itself. Once you deploy this, if you try and access this directly, you're just going to get a 404 error. It doesn't even let you know that it exists. Inside of this Azure function, you can do everything that you need in order to give the roles that you want to give to your users based on the information you get back from your authentication provider. We'll do that one in a second. Where's that one? So we're going to add that. I have a really, really poor implementation of this. I have 2 commas?
Line 23.
I do indeed. Thank you. Where's our API gone? So we're going to add a new file to our API. We're going to call that getRoles.cs, so that's the name that we included inside of that configuration file. And ignore how I am assigning roles here, because that is not good. But you have an Azure function, which is called on a post. And out of that, inside of the body, you get a client principal. Now, a client principal is the way that we give authentication information in all of our static web apps. The difference in this particular case is there are no roles assigned to the user. This is the clean version that you get once a user is actually logged in. We can then use whatever data we have inside of there. So here we have access to that user ID. You can put special information from your authentication provider with custom roles and things that you get on that side. You can read all of that in. You can use a database, whatever else, in order to get the roles that you want for your user. You add them just to a list of string, and you output them. It's a reasonably simple thing to do, and it is a pain in the neck to create because there is no way to test this, at least not easily. The static web app that I showed you that runs locally, it pretends to be the Azure Static Web App in that CLI. One of the things that it pretends to be is authentication. So whether you're using standard or custom authentication, it just takes it over for you, and this you have to test in Azure with application insights and a lot of swearing. But when it does work, it is quite cool. And that's it. That is all that we need to do in order to take that standard authentication and move it into custom authentication. And that's because that level of that layer of abstraction that you get in the standard layer still exists in the custom layer. My code does not need to change at all. It still accesses the auth info and the roles exactly the same way that it did before. And that includes the authorization on my API. So it's a little bit of extra work, but the nice one is that your application itself doesn't have to change. Did my deploy finish? Do we have? Yay, look at that. That finished. So if we go to our pull request, we should now hopefully have a staging environment which is deployed by PR out of the box, and you can see that my environment is the Braze Smoke, blah, 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 staging1.westeurope.azurestaticwebapps.net. That West Europe is also important. When you decide where you want to run your Azure Static Web App, it is not for your static files. It's only for your API. Unless you're in a staging environment, and in which case it does deploy your static files to the region that is assigned to your Azure Static Web App itself. Looking at the time, I'm about out. So I want to move back to my presentation here. And I want my clicker to work. Thank you. I really want to call out these three people because I am not a GitHub workflow expert. I set this up, and thanks to Max, Oscar, and Rick, we managed to get this one working. They helped me for the bits and the workflow-specific stuff that I was scratching my head at. So I really want to call them out. And finally, I used a lot of resources to write this. We had the Static Web App CLI, the AZ Static Web App, the Static Web Apps themselves. And if you go to that QR code, that is a page on my website that links to all of these different resources to help you get started. And shameless plug time, the top resource that I've got inside of that QR code might be a link to my book that I wrote last year on beginning static web apps. It doesn't cover what we've done today, but it does cover getting started. With that, I think I'm about out of time, but if anybody's got any questions, please do come forward. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention today.